The gavel flew across the room. It wasn't a metaphor. A white federal judge actually threw it at a black tomb guard. But what happened after that, no one, not even the judge, saw coming. Can quiet courage expose something even louder than anger? If this story stirs something in you, tap, like share it, and let's walk into the room together. It was just past sunrise at Arlington. The grounds were still damp from the morning dew, and the hush that lingered over the cemetery felt almost sacred, as if time itself paused to watch. Elijah Monroe moved with steady grace 21 deliberate steps along the black mat, a perfect turn, a pause, then 21 steps back again. Every motion was exact, practiced, and silent. Not one word was needed. His presence alone said everything. Elijah wasn't just performing a duty, he was honoring a promise. Each stride whispered to the fallen, "I remember you. You are not forgotten." Just outside the ropes, a white family stood with their phones out trying to capture the precision of the ritual. A little boy in a baseball cap turned away from his mother's lens and stared at Elijah instead. His eyes weren't curious, they were awestruck. Behind the boy stood another child, quiet, much smaller, with skin the color of Elijah's. He looked up at the tomb guard like he was seeing a statue come to life. And for a fleeting second, Elijah's gaze met the boy's. No smile, no nod. Just a look that said, "Stand tall, son, even when the world doesn't see you." When his shift ended, Elijah returned to the guard quarters. The ritual of changing out was solemn, almost monastic. He removed his gloves, unfastened his belt with care, and folded his jacket neatly before placing it in the locker. But just as he reached for his duffel, a plain envelope sat tucked beneath it. No stamp, no seal, just his name printed in sharp block letters. Inside was a summons from the Eastern District Court, a vandalism case. He was being asked to testify. It wasn't a surprise. Elijah had witnessed 2 teenagers spray painting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial 2 weeks prior, and he'd quietly reported it. Nothing more. He hadn't even written a statement. Just gave his name, badge number, and said what he saw. It should have been procedural, routine. But the weight of the envelope told a different story. Later that evening, in the privacy of his small apartment, tucked above a modest bookstore near DuPont Circle, Elijah laid out the clothes he'd wear to court. Not his uniform. Civilians weren't permitted to wear military dress while testifying unless summoned in an official capacity. He chose a charcoal gray suit, simple, respectful, clean. But before folding the blazer, he reached into a small wooden box and retrieved 2 items. A worn silver dog tag edges dulled by time and an old gold wristwatch with a cracked leather band. The tag belonged to Marcus Whitfield. They had served together in Fallujah. Marcus never made it home. The watch belonged to Elijah's father, Henry Monroe, a World War II veteran who fought in the segregated 761st Tank Battalion. Neither man had lived long enough to be thanked properly. Elijah didn't wear the dog tag around his neck. He just carried it left pocket close to the heart. The watch he always wore on his left wrist. A quiet reminder that some battles never end. They just change form. As he sat down, phone in hand, a message popped up from the JAG office at Fort Myer. "Let us know how they treat you." Just that. Nothing else. No emojis. No signatures. And yet the weight of those words pressed on Elijah heavier than the summons itself. How they treat you. Not what happened in court. Not did you see justice done. Just how they treat you. Because they knew. They always knew. He put the phone down, rubbed a hand slowly across his jawline and exhaled. It was a soundless breath, but full of memory. This wasn't the first time he'd walked into a room where the rules didn't seem to apply the same way. He was used to sidelong glances, the stiff tone, the kind of respect that felt like tolerance wrapped in civility. But this time would be different. This time he wasn't just a man with a clean suit and a steady voice. He was a tomb guard. He had stood watch over the unknowns, and tomorrow he would walk into a courtroom where everyone would know exactly who he was, whether they wanted to or not. The courtroom was colder than Elijah expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The moment he stepped through the double doors in his tomb guard uniform, the quiet hum of small talk did not just pause, it pivoted. Heads turned. Conversations dropped to whispers. People scanned his chest, the white gloves, the creases so sharp they looked drawn by ruler. To them, he did not just enter the room, he disturbed it. The benches were full mostly white faces, some in business suits, others in denim and dusty work boots. A few eyes followed him with genuine curiosity, but most flicked over him the way people glance at a warning sign they do not want to read. Near the back, a white woman with a pearl necklace leaned toward her husband and murmured not low enough. He must be making some kind of point showing up like that. Elijah kept walking steady, composed as if the marble floor beneath him were the same sacred path he walked at Arlington. His gloved hands folded calmly in front of him. He was not there to make a point. He was there to tell the truth. But truth had never been the most welcome guest in certain rooms. When the clerk called the judge's entrance, the tension shifted. It was not excitement. It was fear in disguise. Authority had entered the room. Judge William Rourke emerged from his chamber like a king returning to his throne. White, in his early 60s, with deep lines carved between his eyebrows, not from time, but from looking down at people for too long. His robe moved like a curtain closing a show. He gave a tight nod to the jury, then scanned the courtroom. And then he saw Elijah. It was a full stop. Rourke's eyes landed on the uniform, then climbed slowly to Elijah's face, then down again, taking in every detail like a man inspecting something that did not belong. He did not smile. He did not welcome. He simply said, "We do not often get uniforms like yours here. Not thank you for your service. Not glad to have you. Just a thinly veiled warning that this room, this system, this domain was his." Elijah did not flinch. He did not respond. He just gave a respectful nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. But it did not stop the quiet commentary rippling through the benches. Near the front, a white attorney leaned to his colleague and muttered, "Here we go, another one of them using the flag like a shield." The colleague chuckled under his breath. Rourke took his seat slowly like a man lowering himself into power. The gavel rested quietly at his fingertips, but his tone did not need its echo. "I would like to remind everyone," he said with sharp clarity, "this is a court of law, not a parade ground." Someone in the back snorted. Elijah heard it. He felt it. But he did not give them the satisfaction of looking back. Across the courtroom, Ana Castillo, the court clerk, typed rapidly but not blindly. Young Latina and far more observant than most gave her credit for, she stole a glance at Elijah, then at Rourke. Something in her shifted. Just a flicker in her eyes, a pause in her typing. She knew something did not sit right. As the judge began roll call, Elijah remained standing. It was not defiance. It was respect learned through years of guarding the resting places of men and women who had sacrificed everything. He was not used to sitting in front of justice. He was used to standing for it, and still the murmurs around him refused to die. In those few minutes, Elijah understood the room better than any witness list could have told him. This was not just a hearing, it was a stage, the kind where lines were already rehearsed and the ending was known before the first cue. He did not know exactly what lay ahead, but he could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to feel a storm moving in during silent watches at midnight. This was not just about a vandalism case anymore. It was about a uniform some could not stand, a silence some found threatening, and a judge who had already decided who was worthy of the room. And yet Elijah stayed still, silent, steady. Not because he had no voice, but because he knew that in some places, dignity echoes louder than defiance. He did not come to fight. But what happens when justice looks you in the eye and dares you not to stand tall? We were about to find out. Elijah stood at the witness stand with both feet planted firm on the floor, shoulders, still hands resting gently at his sides. When the clerk asked him to state his name and affiliation for the record, he did not hesitate. His voice carried the steadiness of someone who had delivered eulogies in silence and guarded coffins draped in flag. "Elijah Monroe," he said clearly, "Tomb Guard 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment." The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the title held more weight than they expected. Some looked confused, others skeptical. Judge Rourke, however, leaned slightly forward in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as if studying a suspect, not a witness. "So you're here to teach us about patriotism," Rourke said, his words slow, almost oily, in costume. A few heads turned. No one laughed, but the silence afterward was thick enough to smother breath. Elijah did not blink. He did not even shift. "My uniform is not a costume, Your Honor," he answered, his tone even but not cold. "I was off duty, but my duty never really stops." The judge tilted his head as if Elijah had spoken a foreign language he found offensive just by its existence. "Interesting choice of words," he said slowly, dragging out the syllables. "You say you were off duty, yet dressed like that in a courtroom. Are we to assume you're here as a soldier or as a showman?" There was no mistaking the intention. The way Rourke emphasized certain words, letting them sting a little longer than necessary. Soldier carried the tone of sarcasm. Showman had the edge of insult. Elijah turned slightly toward the jury, just enough to make eye contact with them without leaving his post. "I came to testify about what I saw, not to perform," he said calmly. "What I wear is not about show. It's about honoring the men who can't speak for themselves anymore." The room held its breath. Somewhere near the back, a pen tapped nervously on a notebook. Rourke leaned back and forced a chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. "I see. Well, you'll forgive this court if we prefer facts over symbolism." Anna, the court clerk, paused in her typing again. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Eyes narrowed as if she too heard something deeper than the words themselves. Elijah's testimony moved forward. He described the night he saw 3 young men teenagers near the vandalized Veterans Memorial. How 2 of them laughed as they spray-painted over names etched in stone. How one of them stood back looking unsure. He had called the police. He had waited. He had done what any citizen should. But when asked if he could identify the suspects, Elijah paused. "I can describe them," he said, "but I wasn't close enough to see faces clearly." It was after midnight. The area was dim. Rourke's eyes narrowed. Not close enough to identify, but close enough to wear full regalia and still feel your presence mattered. Curious. The implication was clear. He was being questioned not for what he saw, but for who he was and what he dared to wear. Across the courtroom, a woman in a navy blazer leaned toward her friend, speaking just above a whisper. Her voice carried more than she realized. "He's too proud for someone like him," she said. "They always are." Elijah heard it. And for a moment, he did what he had been trained to do. Nothing. He let the words slide across his uniform like rain off polished boots, but the sting wasn't gone. He wasn't new to this. He had heard worse in quieter places from louder mouths, but hearing it here in a federal courtroom in front of a judge who clearly saw his presence as disruption, it landed differently. Still he stood his ground. Still his breathing remained steady. Because the truth, as heavy as it was, still deserved its moment. He finished his statement without embellishment. No dramatic pauses, no sweeping rhetoric, just details, names, timeline, behavior. And when he finished, the silence in the room felt heavier than applause ever could. Rourke stared at him for a beat too long, then gave a curt nod and said, "You may step down, but I caution you, Mr. Monroe. This is a courtroom, not a cemetery. You don't need to carry ghosts with you here." That was the moment the tension shifted, because Elijah did not reply. He just turned, walked back to his seat, and sat down as if nothing had been said. But the room knew. The room heard it. The courtroom had seen many things, but what it had never quite seen before was the quiet, immovable dignity of a man being insulted by a robe and choosing silence as his answer. And that silence, it echoed louder than any gavel. The courtroom faded as Elijah Monroe sat still, his posture a mirror of discipline, but his mind drifting. The sharp click of Judge Rourke's gavel faded behind the hum of memory. He could almost smell the sweat-drenched gear, the desert dust grinding into every crease of his uniform, and the metallic tang of blood that wasn't his own. It was Tyrone Carter's, his best friend, his brother in arms, the one who didn't make it home. They were ambushed on patrol. The enemy waited in silence, letting the squad pass just far enough before opening fire. Chaos erupted. Elijah remembered going down the searing pain in his side, the shouting, the dust, and then Tyrone tackling him to the ground, shielding him. That moment replayed endlessly. Tyrone's face was the last he saw before blacking out. Tyrone had no family, no medals, no memorial. Just Elijah, just memory. Back in the States, Elijah didn't talk about the war, not because he couldn't, but because no one asked. What they did ask when they saw the color of his skin before the uniform was, "You sure you earned that badge?" Even some of his own squad had questioned his loyalty, whispered doubts in locker rooms and barracks. One had called him a token hero after the ambush. Elijah never forgot that. When he came home, he didn't go looking for vengeance or praise. He signed up for law school, studying in the back row, quietly, slowly. He said it was to know how deep the river runs before stepping in, but truthfully, it was to understand his own rights. Too many times he'd seen them brushed aside like lint off a lapel, and then came the tomb. Not by chance, but by choice. Elijah applied to be a tomb guard at Arlington, knowing it would be silent work, disciplined work, the kind that stripped away ego. But to him, it was a vigil. Not just for the fallen, but for the forgotten black soldiers who had bled for a country that still looked through them. He remembered standing in front of the white marble, 21 steps up, 21 down. His spine straight, chin lifted, breath steady. Tourists whispered. Some saluted. Others just snapped photos. But now and then a little black boy would stop and stare not at the tomb, but at him. That's why he stayed. Judge Rourke had smirked at the uniform earlier. But Elijah didn't wear it to impress. He wore it because when he buried Tyrone, he promised he would stand where others were erased. He would show up. And now here he was, in a courtroom that looked nothing like justice, wearing a badge that felt more like a target, holding his silence not out of fear, but out of respect for those who could no longer speak. They said we fought for freedom. Elijah thought, eyes locked on the polished wood before him. But some freedoms never make it back home. Still, he sat tall. Dignity doesn't shout. It outlasts. Elijah had barely finished giving his statement when Judge Rourke leaned forward, folding his hands as if preparing for a performance. His voice cut through the room like a cold draft. "You expect this court to treat your word as enough? No corroboration? No evidence? Just a uniform and a few honorable words?" Elijah met his gaze without flinching. His posture remained respectful, but his eyes didn't lower. "I reported what I saw because it was the truth. I didn't come here to be believed. I came because it was right." The judge tilted his head slightly as if inspecting a cracked relic. "We've seen men like you bluff before." That sentence did not fall gently. It landed with the weight of generations, not just because of what was said, but because of what was meant. The room held its breath, or maybe it was just Elijah who stopped breathing for a moment. "Men like you." The words weren't about truth. They were about skin. From the gallery, a quiet cough echoed. A black man, perhaps in his 70s, shifted in his seat. He wore a faded veteran's pin on his lapel, and his eyes had turned a deep, unblinking red. His hands were clenched on the edge of the bench. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Elijah drew a long breath and answered, his tone even. "My record speaks. My service speaks. The dead I buried, those speak too." Rourke let the silence sit, as if savoring it. Then he smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile one reserves for a child who's overreached. "This is a court of law, Mr. Monroe, not a history museum for black heroes." A low murmur passed through the gallery. Not outrage, just discomfort. That quiet, shifting kind of silence that comes when a line has been crossed and no one knows whether to acknowledge it or pretend it didn't happen. Elijah didn't move. His body stayed still, but something behind his eyes flickered. For the first time, his hands resting on the wooden witness stand curled just slightly at the edges. Not clenched, not shaking, just alive with restraint. He could have said so many things. He could have stood up and named every black soldier buried without a name, every medal awarded too late, every courtroom that turned away testimony because the voice delivering it came from the wrong skin. But he said nothing. And somehow that silence sounded louder than the judge's voice. It pressed against the walls. It reached into the cracks. It lingered. The woman 2 rows behind the old veteran leaned slightly toward her friend and whispered something Elijah couldn't hear. But he saw the shake of her head, the glance toward the bench, and then away, as if even she felt the weight of what had been said. Anna, the court clerk, paused in her typing. Her fingers hovered for a second over the keys. Then almost defiantly she resumed. The judge shuffled his papers and cleared his throat, clearly moving on. But Elijah remained locked in place, not by fear, not by anger, but by memory. He was used to being questioned, used to being looked through, but not like this. Not here. He thought of Tyrone again, thought of the day they were told the rules didn't apply in war, that only the mission mattered. But now, in this room filled with polished wood and powdered wigs of authority, it felt like the war had never ended. It had only changed uniforms. Still, Elijah sat upright. Still, he chose dignity over reaction. Still, he waited. Because justice, when it comes, must be able to look itself in the eye, and some men he knew could not. The room was already tense, but when Judge Rourke slammed his hand against the bench and shouted, the stillness cracked like glass. "Take that hat off!" He barked, his voice louder than it needed to be, edged with something more than authority. "This isn't your parade ground, Mr. Monroe." The air went thin. Even those who had been fidgeting in their seats sat motionless. Elijah stood still, the black and gold tomb guard cover resting firmly atop his head, precisely aligned as regulations demanded. He looked up, eyes calm, voice low but unwavering. "Sir, as per the Sentinel's creed and regulation AR 600-25, the hat remains unless removed for the fallen. I wear it in honor of the silent." He said no more. He did not need to. That was when it happened. With a furious sweep of his arm, Rourke flung the gavel across the courtroom. It struck the ground with a loud crack that echoed off the marble like a gunshot. Several people gasped. A woman in the back grabbed her child's shoulder protectively. Somewhere to the left, someone whispered under their breath, "Did he just—" Elijah did not flinch. He turned, stepped slowly from the witness stand, crossed the space between him and the gavel, and bent down. His fingers touched the polished wood with the same care he might give a folded flag. He walked back to this bench. Not rushing, not dramatic, just deliberate, dignified. He placed the gavel squarely on the bench in front of the stunned judge. Then he looked him directly in the eye and spoke evenly, each word as heavy as stone. "Under Title 18, Section 111 of the United States Code, that constitutes assault on a federal witness." The room stopped breathing. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence that followed did the shouting for him. People turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to something else. Disbelief, concern, maybe even shame. Judge Rourke stared at the gavel like it had betrayed him. His hand twitched, unsure whether to reach for it or push it away. Anna, the clerk, glanced at Elijah, then at the judge, then back again. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, uncertain whether to record what just happened or wait for the room to move again. In the gallery, the same black veteran from earlier shook his head slowly, almost like he had seen this before many times, and yet it still found a way to cut deeper each time. No one dared speak. Even the bailiff, who had stood stone-faced throughout most of the hearing, shifted his weight, eyes flickering between the judge and Elijah, as if realizing for the first time that the balance of power in this room might not be where he thought it was. But Elijah did not press the moment. He did not grandstand. He simply turned back toward the witness stand and resumed his seat, his back straight, his hands resting quietly in his lap. He had said what needed to be said. He had done what needed to be done. And in that moment, the court, this institution built on order and hierarchy, and the illusion of impartiality, felt off-center like a table with one short leg that suddenly everyone noticed. The gavel, once a symbol of unquestioned power, had become something else entirely, and Judge Rourke, who moments ago had wielded it like a weapon, now sat with nothing in his hand but the weight of what he had done. There are some silences that demand answers. This was one of them. Judge Rourke's jaw tightened. The courtroom had fallen into a tension so thick it almost vibrated. No one moved. No one dared. Elijah stood tall, his voice calm, but this time there was a sharpness beneath every word. Under canon, one of the Code of Conduct for United States, judges' integrity and independence must be upheld. Under canon 2, impartiality must not only exist, but be visible to the public. Each syllable landed like hammer strikes against a wall that had stood for too long. Rourke leaned forward, his tone turning cold. Are you lecturing this court now, Sergeant? I'm citing your oath, Elijah replied, eyes steady. The one you seem to have misplaced. The courtroom gasped, but it wasn't loud. It was collective, inhaled, contained, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then the heavy doors creaked. A woman's voice rang out clear and absolute. Colonel Grace Whitmore, senior legal advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The tension shattered like glass. Even Rourke blinked. She walked forward with the bearing of someone who had walked through bureaucratic fire and come out untouched. Every step echoed across the marble floor like a verdict already handed down. She didn't ask permission. She didn't bow to the bench. She turned to the audience, then to the judge, and spoke without hesitation. This court is now in possession of classified but declassifiable evidence regarding this judge's consistent dismissal of petitions from black veterans. From the back, someone whispered, "No way." Colonel Whitmore opened the folder in her hand, held it up for all to see, and handed it to Anna, the court clerk. Included are transcripts, sealed audio recordings, and email correspondences between this bench and state prosecutors showing a clear bias pattern. Rourke turned pale but said nothing. Anna's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents, eyes scanning with increasing disbelief. "I remember these," Anna said louder than she meant to. "I typed these. I remember how they were dismissed." Colonel Whitmore nodded once. "And now you know why." She looked to Elijah, then back to the judge. Sergeant Monroe stood here in full view of this court, representing not just the uniform, but every black soldier whose voice was silenced inside these walls. Today, he didn't come to win a case. He came to break a cycle. A hush settled again. This time not from fear, but from something that felt like awakening. Elijah's voice cut through the silence, lower now, slower. "I buried friends who never got to raise their hands in a courtroom. I wore this uniform not for applause, but because someone had to remain standing." Rourke finally rose from his seat, but it was too late. His presence no longer commanded the room. He opened his mouth, but even Anna spoke before he could. "These documents," she said firmly, "they match. Word for word, date after date. This isn't coincidence, it's a pattern." Colonel Whitmore turned back to the gallery. "You have a choice. Keep pretending the system isn't broken, or face it because men like Sergeant Monroe do every day in silence." There was no gavel slam, no closing remark. Just the sound of a structure cracking, an old kingdom of impunity beginning to fall right there in real time. And for the first time, the courtroom wasn't watching a trial. They were watching a reckoning. The room did not breathe. For a full 5 seconds, silence clung to the walls like smoke after a battlefield blast. Then the side door creaked open again, this time with the weight of finality. She walked in slowly. A short woman in a dark judicial robe, her steps unhurried, her eyes steady as though she had seen storms like this before. Chief Judge Laura Bennett. Her presence did not roar. It did not need to. It settled over the room with quiet authority, and everyone knew something irreversible was about to unfold. She nodded once to the bailiff, then took the documents handed to her by Colonel Whitmore. Her fingers moved without hesitation. As she read, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker, not louder. She flipped to the second page, then the third. Finally, she looked up. Her voice was low, but each word carried like it had been etched into stone. "Judge Rourke, based on this evidence and under emergency procedural authority, you are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately." Gasps rolled across the room like a slow tide. Rourke did not speak at first. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked around as if searching for someone who would object on his behalf. No one moved. Then he found his voice, but it cracked at the edges. "That man provoked this. He came in here dressed for confrontation, not for justice." Judge Bennett did not blink. Her reply was colder than marble. "No. He came prepared to be heard. But you exposed yourself." The words struck harder than a shout. Even the walls seemed to flinch. Rourke gripped the edge of his bench, knuckles pale. "You have no jurisdiction to make this." "I do." Bennett interrupted, her tone sharpened. "Now, when the integrity of this court is compromised under my authority, you may address your concerns in writing, outside this courtroom." Rourke stood there, unmoving, face reddening, not just from anger, but from the realization that this was no longer his domain. His nameplate sat before him like a badge stripped of meaning. Then came a sound no one expected. From the third row, a black man in a plain suit slowly rose. His eyes were red not from rage, but from years of knowing this day might never come. He did not say a word. He did not need to. Beside him another man stood, and then another. Veterans. Quiet. Upright. Their presence was louder than protest. Then, one by one, others began to rise. White men, Latino, women, even a young court intern in the back row. No fists raised, no slogans, just people standing. Silent acknowledgement that something wrong had finally been named, and someone had finally said enough. Rourke turned slowly, scanning the room, hoping for someone still seated, still loyal. But all he saw were backs straightened in quiet defiance. The bailiff approached. "Sir, you need to step away from the bench." He hesitated. His jaw clenched. His eyes burned not with guilt, but humiliation. Still, he stepped down. Elijah had not moved. Not an inch. Not since the chief judge walked in. His posture had not changed, but his breath had. Slower, deeper. Like a weight invisible but relentless had just slipped from his chest. Judge Bennett turned to him then. Just a glance. But it was not one of praise. It was respect. The kind earned in silence. As Rourke was escorted through the doors, one final moment hung in the air. He looked back, eyes bitter. But he did not speak again, because nothing he said now would matter. The court had turned its back, and the truth had finally found a voice that did not have to shout to be heard. It started with a 10-second clip. No music, no narrator, just courtroom security footage, grainy but clear. It showed Elijah Monroe walking forward after the gavel flew past his head. He bent down, picked it up calmly, and placed it back on the bench. The caption at the bottom read, "He didn't flinch." By noon it was everywhere. Morning news anchors paused to replay the footage. Commentators stopped mid-sentence when it aired live on panel shows. In airports and bus stations it played on silent screens. In barbershops, break rooms, and church basements, people leaned forward to watch it again. But Elijah said nothing. He declined interviews, turned down late-night show requests, ignored book agents and podcast hosts. He showed up to his post at Arlington the next day like it was any other morning, stepping out with precision shoulders squared, hands gloved. He saluted the silence, not the noise. Still the noise grew. The JAG Corps announced a full review of Judge Rourke's decisions related to military veterans, especially cases involving racial bias. A press release landed quietly, but within hours, journalists unearthed transcripts that told their own stories. Repeated dismissals, questioning of character, and backhanded remarks that had once passed as formality. Then came the voices. At first, just a few. A former Marine who had been denied appeal in a benefits hearing. An Army widow whose testimony Rourke had cut short mid-sentence. A veteran who said Rourke called his PTSD claim exaggerated drama and questioned whether he had actually seen combat. They had never spoken publicly before. But now they did. More followed. Church bulletins printed their names. Veterans' halls reopened long-forgotten files. A retired colonel posted an old ruling online with a handwritten note. He smiled while he wrote this. Underneath, someone commented, "Not anymore." And then a mother. She wrote a letter, just 6 lines typed and signed in pen. It was photographed and shared by a friend, and by morning it was quoted in headlines across the country. "My son fought for this country. He was black. He deserved better. His case was dismissed without a hearing. I heard that man say, 'We don't rewrite history here.' But my son wasn't history. He was alive. He mattered." The nation read her words not with shock, but with recognition. It was not just one story. It was many. Too many. Some tried to deflect, called it an overreaction, claimed Elijah staged the moment. But truth does not need to shout when it walks in calm. Anna, who had sat silently in that courtroom, now wrote. In a blog post titled "White Gloves," she described what she witnessed. Not just the chaos, but the poise, the restraint, the weight that had not been thrown but carried. Her words echoed across digital platforms like quiet thunder. Justice does not always come loud. Sometimes it comes wearing white gloves. The post was shared by teachers, veterans, even federal clerks. Someone added a line beneath it, and that too began to spread. He did not win by shouting. He won by standing. No one knew what Elijah would say next, but everyone was watching. And for once, the system, The same one that had once dismissed and buried began to shift. Slowly, uneasily, but unmistakably it moved toward acknowledgement, toward truth, toward something that sounded a little like justice. The wind that morning moved slow, like it knew the weight of the day. Elijah Monroe stepped onto the path just before sunrise, his boots pressing gently against the stone, each movement deliberate. There were no reporters, no guards escorting him, no salutes, just the rhythm of breath, the rustle of his gloves, and the hush that always wrapped itself around the tomb. He had said nothing since the courtroom, had given no speeches written, no statements. He simply returned to his post as if nothing had happened, as if the echoes from the courtroom had not shaken the country awake. But those who watched him that morning saw something different. They saw a man who knew exactly where he stood. He faced forward, spine-straight arms at rest. Then came the 20 nun steps, measured, timed, eternal. And from behind the rope, the boy returned. The same child who had watched him weeks ago, too young to understand rank or regulation, but old enough to sense when someone was worth watching. This time he did not clutch his mother's coat or whisper questions. He stood straight, chest lifted, eyes bright. And then, without prompting, he raised his hand in salute. The gesture was not perfect. His fingers were off angle and his stance wobbled. But Elijah saw it, not with his eyes which never drifted from the ground in front of him, but with something deeper, something that stirred in the space behind his silence. He did not break stride, but as he passed the midpoint and turned his hand brushed the dog tag tucked beneath his chest. A simple motion so small it could have been mistaken for a wrinkle or a shift in uniform. But it was not. He felt the cold press of the metal. He remembered Tyrone's laughter in the back of the Humvee, the way he hummed off key when everyone else had gone quiet. He remembered the heat of the ambush, the moment when everything could have ended, and the weight of a body thrown across his own to shield him from fire. He remembered why he was still here. As he walked, he did not hear the quiet sniffles behind the ropes or the tourists who lowered their cameras without quite knowing why. He did not hear the soft voice of a woman who said almost in a whisper, "That's him." He only heard the silence, and the silence spoke clearly. Then something new. An old man in a faded army jacket stood at the back. His hair was silver, his posture curved, and his skin pale as the marble. He had been standing there the whole time unnoticed. But as Elijah completed his final turn and stepped back to post, the man lifted his hand in salute, not out of habit, not out of ceremony, but slowly with intention, as if saluting not a uniform, but the man inside it. It was the first time anyone had ever seen that happen. Elijah's gaze did not waver. His body did not respond. But something in the moment stretched between them, unspoken, undeniable. It crossed time, rank, race, and regret. It held every story that had never been told, every injustice that had been swallowed, every name forgotten in the footnotes of someone else's war. Still, Elijah remained still, because the tomb does not move for applause. It does not bend for praise. It stands because others no longer can. Later that night, long after the tourists had gone and the marble steps had cooled in the moonlight, the story would be told again. Some would speak of what happened in that courtroom. Others would talk about the boy or the old soldier, or the way Elijah never blinked when the gavel flew past him. But those who knew, those who understood the language of silence, would remember something else. They would remember that Elijah Monroe never needed to raise his voice to be heard, because some men raise their voices, others raise a standard, and Elijah Monroe did both without ever shouting, and the tomb never sleeps. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect on what Elijah Monroe stood for. Not just silence, but strength. Not just service, but sacrifice. In a world where too many voices are drowned out, he reminded us that dignity can speak without a single word and still shake a nation awake. At Echo Blind, we tell stories that linger long after the final line. Stories that remind us justice is not always loud, but it is always worth the fight. If this message meant something to you, please, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to hit subscribe to follow more powerful stories like this. Your support gives our team the strength to keep creating content that matters. Every view, every share, every comment, it all helps carry these stories forward. Because at Echo Blind, we don't just tell stories. We remember them, and we make sure the silence never goes unheard.